Today we're going to talk about the deductive inference. And this is the third operation of the mind. So we talked about kind of a simple apprehension. And when we verbalize that by writing it down or saying it out loud, it becomes a term. And then we talked about a judgment, things that we make in our minds that when we write them down or say them out loud, they become a proposition. So now we're going to talk about the third thing that the mind does, and that is it moves from or I'm sorry, we're going to talk about the third step that the mind does, which is the simple apprehension. I'm sorry, the deductive inference. And the deductive inference takes two judgments and moves to a third judgment that is logically necessary. Okay. And this is what we call reasoning. Your book defines reasoning as the act by which the mind acquires new knowledge by means of what it already knows. So if you take one, and let's use the syllogism that we've been using since the beginning. All men are mortal. It's kind of running out, isn't it? And that's not very clear. So let me see if I can get that. Socrates is a man. Okay. So here we have two propositions in our minds, two judgments. And within those judgments, we have terms, right? So your mind has taken the simple apprehension of the term man, or its plural form men, and there's some extension to it. In your mind, you've extended that to every man everywhere that ever has been, is currently, or ever will be. And so when we say all men, that's essentially what this men is referring to. Your first judgment, your first proposition, states that all men are mortal. So in argumentation, if we were going to argue this syllabus, we would have to, I'm sorry, the syllogism, we would have to argue the um, the judgments themselves, the premises, as they're called. All right, so what I've done here is I've circled men, man, it's the same term. And then you have two other terms here, mortal and Socrates. So mortal, independent of this judgment, is a word that you know and understand. Things have an end to them. They will die. They will cease to be living. Socrates, a particular person in history. And we've structured two so I'm sorry, we've structured two judgments or two propositions together. And what happens is a conclusion necessarily follows. The conclusion is that Socrates is mortal. Okay. And we've used kind of the circles to understand this. All men belongs to the category of mortal things. That's your first statement, your first proposition. Your second proposition simply states is that Socrates is a man. And so then, if we combine these two ideas, it necessarily follows that Socrates belongs to the category of mortal. And so you see two more terms show up down here, but they're reused terms. In other words, there is Socrates, just like it is in the second proposition there. And there's the word mortal, just like it is in the first proposition. Okay, so we're going to give these names, these particular terms that exist inside of these propositions that combine to give us this deductive inference. And this deductive inference that we do in our minds, now that I've written it down, this is no longer a deductive inference, this is a syllogism. And we're using reasoning. Based on two things that we already know, we're moving to a third statement, that Socrates is mortal. So, we name these terms certain things within the syllogism. And remember that in a syllogism, we always have the copula. Whoops, drop something there. We always have the copula. The copula is a to be verb that is linking two terms together. So in each one of these propositions, we have a subject and a predicate, a subject and a predicate, a subject and a predicate. So here, men is the subject, mortal's the predicate, Socrates is the subject, man the predicate, Socrates is the subject, mortal's the predicate. So we're going to start with the conclusion here. This Socrates right here, that is going to get an S. Okay, and mortal, that's going to get a P for subject and predicate. But S in particular is going to be known as the minor term. And P in particular is known as the major term. So the predicate of the conclusion is the major term in the syllogism, and the subject of the conclusion is the minor term in the syllogism. And that carries through the whole syllogism. So now I go back into the first and second propositions, and I identify my major and my minor terms. So you see here that the minor term is in the second proposition, and the major term is in the first proposition. So what that means is that this proposition here is what's known as the major proposition. And this proposition here with the minor term is known as the minor proposition. So whether it's the minor or the major proposition depends on whether it has the major or minor term. Now you'll notice there's still another term here, man and men. Same term. It exists both in the major and the minor premise, and we call this the middle term. The reason it's called the middle is because it's what links the major and minor premise together to then move us to the next state of knowledge. It's the exercise of reason and come to a new judgment or proposition. All right. If I have followed correct form, the syllogism is valid. If I have a true major premise and a true minor premise, and it is valid, then I have a sound argument, and the conclusion is inescapable. It necessarily follows. So there's something called the essential law of argumentation. And what the essential law of argumentation does, and in order to explain this, we'll kind of put some things together here. All right, this part of the syllogism is called the antecedent. All right. And I don't remember, I think the book tells us about the Latin root of antecedent. Let me see if I can find that real quick. Yeah, antecedents made up of two Latin words, ante, which means before, and sedere, which means to go. So these statements here are to go before, then what's known as the conclusion, also known as the consequent. The consequent is the consequence of the antecedent. All right. So in the essential law of argumentation, if the antecedent is true, the consequent must also be true. Okay. So this is only true if it's a valid syllogism. If the antecedent is true, then the consequent must be true. So not only are each one of these propositions true, we know that the conclusion is true because it follows from reason. If Socrates belongs to the category of men, and men belongs to the category of mortal things, then it's necessary that Socrates belongs to the category of mortal things. We could see that Socrates is fully within that circle. All right. And there are two corollaries. The first is this: if the syllogism is valid and the consequent is false, then the antecedent must be false. Okay. If it's a valid syllogism and the conclusion is actually false, it must needs be that something in the antecedent is false. So we'll give an example. All men are sinners. My dog Spot is a sinner. Therefore, my dog Spot. I'm sorry, no. All men are sinners. My dog Spot is a man. Therefore, my dog Spot is a sinner. Well, the dogs cannot be sinners, so something has to be wrong. Even though it's in the proper form, something must be wrong with the antecedent. And what's wrong with the antecedent is my dog Spot is a man. That is false. All right, so that's kind of the first corollary to the essential law of argumentation that states if the antecedent is true, the consequent must be true. Now, the second corollary is that in a valid syllogism, where the consequent is true, it does not necessarily follow that the antecedent is true. Okay. And I'll give you, even if it's valid and this is true, it doesn't mean this is true. Remember what the law of argumentation states. It only states that if it's valid and the antecedent is true, then it's necessary that the consequent is true. So if the consequent is true and it's valid, it doesn't follow that the antecedent is true. Okay, so we can go forward, we cannot go backward. I'll give you an example. All vegetables are philosophers. Socrates is a vegetable. Therefore, Socrates is a philosopher. It's a valid syllogism, and the conclusion is true. Socrates is a philosopher. But it's not true that vegetables are philosophers or that Socrates is a vegetable. And so there are just two quick examples of how the corollaries to that work. All right. Let's see. All right, so before we get into the terminological rules and the categories, let's go ahead and just stop that for now. I think this is a good setup. I know it's kind of a short session, but I think this will give us what we need because now we're kind of in a position that we can start looking at more syllogisms than this just this one. Yeah, so we'll go from there. Sounds good. See you next time.